Thank you all for being here. My name is Steadman Upham, and I have the great good fortune of serving as president of the University of Tulsa. We're here for another intellectual excursion at the Helmrich Center for American Research. I think all of you know that this building holds the Gilcrease archive and library, and that collection of documents is diverse but in topical prose. It covers the period of Spanish exploration of the New World. It covers the founding of American democracy, correspondence from the founding fathers, and documents about the organization of the original United States. And then it chronicles in great detail the saga of native removal and resettlement in Oklahoma and surrounding areas. So it is an amazing collection, and it is going to be joined as we work hard to bring other archival collections into this building so that we can expand the kind of scholarship that takes place. We've had one symposium, an inaugural symposium before, but this is the first symposium that we have had that has been built around our Visiting Scholars Program. We started a Visiting Scholars Program so specialists in different areas could come and be in residence here for a period of time and study the collections, and then turn their studies into presentations, and then down the road also to help us build exhibits for the public at the museum. So this is kind of a first that we've had visiting scholars, and we have 3 of our presenters today who have been part of that program. I don't see John and Dee Dee Stewart, but they are very generous funders of this program. If you see them, please thank them. Let me take a moment to recognize somebody very important who has been the founding director of this facility. Dwayne King, would you please stand up and let us give you a round of applause? Those of you that have followed the partnership between the University of Tulsa and the City of Tulsa, management of Gilcrease Museum know that a number of years ago we asked Dwayne to come in and be the founding director in that management arrangement, and he served with distinction. When the Helmrich Center for American Research came online, we needed his expertise again to create, literally not completely out of whole cloth because these amazing collections, but to create a series of programs and activities around the archives. And Dwayne, thank you for your energy and really appreciate everything you've done. We have a wonderful program of presentations today. And it's an honor for me to introduce our first speaker, W. Richard West, Jr. Richard is currently the president and CEO of the Autry National Center of the American West. And he has had, that's the latest in a string of very distinguished appointments. He was the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian, and he served in that capacity from 1990 through 2007. And during that tenure, he didn't just lead the museum that was created on the National Mall in that iconic building, but he also oversaw the opening of the George Gustav High Center in New York City, and the Cultural Resources Center in Sweetland, Maryland, and really created a complete organization around the amazing collections that are now housed at that museum. Richard practiced law in Albuquerque and in Washington, D.C. He is an Oklahoman. He grew up in Muskogee. He completed his bachelor's degree at the University of Redlands, which happens to be my alma mater, and we go way back. He then completed a master's degree at Harvard before attending Stanford University School of Law, where he edited the Stanford Law Review. Richard, we're really happy you're back in Oklahoma. Please welcome W. Richard West.
Thank you very much, Steadman. I'm indeed delighted to be here, to see you, and to be back in Oklahoma. And throughout the day, you will hear some very wonderful presentations that are about specific subjects that are dealt with on a scholarly basis, and I look forward to hearing them with you. What I'm doing is sort of introduction to all of that. It does have connection, actually, with some of the people speaking at this seminar. Gaylord, who was one of the speakers you will hear today, and I had a conversation at the Prix de West last June when I was down here in Oklahoma for that event. And we were talking about sort of the nature, if you will, of native art and native art objects. And so what I will be discussing with you today is simply backdrop, if you will, a more general approach, a director's approach, if you will, to native art and art objects, as prelude, if you will, to the wonderful specifics, which I think you are going to hear for the rest of the day. I begin this morning with a lawyer's caveats and disclosures rather than a museum director's sense of automatic prerogative to speak on anything he likes. First, what I would say to you this morning is very much a personal perspective on native art and art objects. I claim no special prescience that makes what I offer now more important than what anyone else in this distinguished group of presenters today is going to say. And I know them all to be precisely that. I also know that the subject of native art and objects has sat close to me and has for all of my life. I thus want to lend whatever I can in the way of experience and perspective to our discussions today, and without being presumptuous about their value. Second, my journeys in native art are multiple and are both personal and professional. Genetics play a large part in my journeys. I was born the son of a gifted and prominent native artist, a painter and a sculptor, who had substantial impact on the course of native art in much of the late 20th century. My non-native mother was an accomplished pianist, and had it not been for the untimely arrival of my brother and me, she might have pursued a career as a concert pianist. So the arts generally and native art specifically were all around me as I grew up in Oklahoma. I am your homeboy speaker for the day, and proud of every moment I have spent here. For my brother and me, the Philbrook Art Center and the Gilcrease Museum were practically second homes, as two of the principal venues for much of my father's work and professional life as a painter and sculptor in a transformational generation of contemporary native art. In my own professional life, I also made my way, ultimately, if somewhat belatedly, back to the home field of native art and objects. I admittedly had a considerable diversion into the practice of law, largely inexplicable to my artist parents, especially since my younger brother compounded things by becoming a banker for a number of years. I shall always be grateful that my dad lived long enough to see me become the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. He felt, in his own words, that finally I had come in from the cold and started earning an honest living. I value greatly the totality and the cross-currents of the experience in native arts that flowed from this personal path. I say this because it allowed me to see the native art up close for a lifetime, while at the same time having the opportunity to know the Western art history context in which they live and develop in this country, and thus to appreciate the issues that shape and sometimes challenge the interpretation of native art and objects that originate in vastly different histories and traditions. To state the point metaphorically, the distance is considerable from Bacon College near Muskogee, Oklahoma, where I grew up, or from the Cheyenne communities in El Reno, Sealing, and Hammond, where my native cultural grounding took place, to the Smithsonian Institution's Museum Row on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It is this meeting point between worlds our own and not our own, between artistic traditions and histories originating in Indian country and those not, that a dynamism and even a tension exist, for me, that is important in any discussion of native art and objects, and perhaps even to the presentations and conversations here today. My point is perhaps best illustrated by two contrasting stories from real life. The first involves Eugene Thaw, highly successful and learned New York collector and art dealer, a generous benefactor of the NMAI during my tenure there, and at this point, a close personal friend of mine who had an eye for native art and objects akin to gods. Many years ago, as he was introducing me to his collections at his home in Tusuki, New Mexico, he gently picked up an exquisite carved Tsimshian bowl and held it up between us. With a facial expression that can only be described as rapt and reverential, he pronounced, "Nothing in the entirety of the Renaissance surpasses this object in sheer aesthetic quality." From the standpoint of the system of aesthetics as we have come to know it in Western art, Gene was entirely correct. The second anecdote involves my father and me, as a young child, at the Philbrook Art Center. There, during a tour through the galleries and collections that he and I often visited when we were there together, we came upon a Tlingit object in that museum's significant native collections, not at all dissimilar in artistic and aesthetic quality from the piece I saw a half-century later with Gene Thaw. My father told me initially of the object's remarkable beauty, including its material, the artist's technical skill, the use of color, and the breathtaking lines of the piece. Then, with a slight chuckle, he added, "The only problem is that's not what it really means." And therein lie questions and issues that I have pondered for all of my life in understanding and interpreting native art and objects. What is native art? How do we define its meaning? How do we measure its value and importance in cultural terms? And what interpretive terms and standards apply? In approaching these questions for the balance of my presentation, I want to use the following organizational scheme. First, I want to have a look at the world that sits beyond Indian country and that lives according to the maxims and dictates of Western art history. Second, I would like to address as cultural and artistic counterpoint how I view the differing approaches of native artists and what they created through a lengthy arc of time. Having lived when I was the director of the NMAI directly across the National Mall from the National Gallery of Art, I certainly know the answers to these questions that Western art history and traditions provide. At one time in its history, art in Europe was very much a part of daily living. The creation of beautiful objects in churches, for example, was an undertaking on behalf of the community, and the material was used every day as part of its ritual and ceremonial life. But European and Western art history took a sharp turn with the arrival of the Renaissance in the 16th century. These objects, figuratively speaking, left the churches and in the next 2 centuries moved into private collections and ultimately into private and public museums. There they left behind their previous social, cultural, ceremonial, and ritual context and became instead art objects. With that transition also came numerous rubrics of representation and interpretation that became and remained the very bedrock and undergirding of Western art history and aesthetic viewpoint. Definitional distinctions in categories that correlated with artistic achievement, recognition, and value were established. Fine art, which for example included 2- and 3-dimensional visual art, represented a far higher mark on the very linear Western path to high art. By contrast, anything smacking of craft, such as ceramics, was relegated to the category of low art and had far less status in the Western art and aesthetic calculus. The social and cultural context of objects was deemed largely irrelevant because art objects were considered to be purely individual creations of universal meanings. Within these ground rules and definitional prescriptions, native artists dating from the last half of the 20th century have competed and worked as fine artists, but often with great challenges. My father spent much of his life as a native artist trying to get off the ethnographic walls of natural history museums and into art galleries and museums. I have a painting at home, one of my favorites, by my dad that was juried into the Corcoran Biennial in 1962. But the path to such places for native artists at that time was highly infrequent and difficult, and it took a very daring art museum to sign on. Even in museums that considered such paintings as fine art, the rules sometimes could be rather odd and narrow, and again defined in almost anthropological terms that were the cruel legacy of previous history. I remember my dad's extreme disappointment and displeasure at a Filbert biennial jury's refusal to accept a work by Oscar Howe because he was not painting Indian. Cubism may have gotten Picasso and others into the MoMA in New York, but it kept Oscar Howe out of Filbert the better part of a century ago. I seem to recall also that Alan Hauser and Dorothy Dunn had similar discussions regarding the parameters of being a native artist and painter. The takeaway from this part of my presentation is this. I applaud and admire those native artists or artists who were native in successfully breaching the historical barriers that often have prohibited their being considered fine artists and thus capable of creating high art, the gold medal of Western art. But it is a victory that still often leaves me puzzling and slightly troubled because it is premised on a construct for art and aesthetic expression that I do not necessarily consider our own. I want to be sure, as a Cheyenne, as the founding director and director emeritus of the National Museum of the American Indian, and as the president and the CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West, heir to the magnificent native collections of the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in Los Angeles, that we also continue to recognize and value those precepts and values that have grounded native arts and the creative process for the millennia. And I thus now turn to the second part of my presentation this morning. I want to describe as best I can the paradigm that undergirds and defines the creation of native art, whatever medium may be at issue. First, while it often comes as a considerable shock to those grounded in the traditions of Western art and less familiar with Indian material culture, the object, if anything, was a secondary consideration to the primacy of the ceremonial or ritual process that led to its creation. In other words, despite the remarkable aesthetic qualities of much of the cultural material we created, our purpose in the end was not per se the creation of art. A former colleague of mine at the NMAI spoke directly to this point when she wrote, "The native artist values the creation of art over the final product. Process speaks to historical or cultural significance because it is testimony to cultural continuity and change. It is the evidence of lost traditions, innovations, preserved cultural knowledge, historic perspective, and vision of the future. It takes into account a sort of spiritual evidence that is integral to the creative process. That integrity of the creative process is foremost. The object is meaningless without it." Native objects in their most profound and ultimate dimension really were statements and reflections, and were intended to be so, of collective and communal values as much or more than they were individual creative statements. I remember visiting many years ago the Millicent Rogers Museum in Tulsa, New Mexico. I was looking at a truly magnificent ceramic, sculpted by the hand and spirit of Popovi Day, the brilliance of Julian and Maria Martinez of the San Ildefonso Pueblo. I was content to stand there, transfixed for a very long time, simply lost in its aesthetic beauty. My eye, however, finally moved to a piece of text that had been placed next to the pot, and it turned out to be a statement by Popovi Day himself. I've never forgotten the words because they spoke volumes about Popovi Day's world and how his personal creativity related to it. Indeed, arguably was subsumed by that world. "We do what comes from thinking," he said, "and sometimes hours and even days are spent to create an aesthetic scroll in design. Our symbols and our representations are all expressed as an endless cadence and beautifully organized in our art as well as in our dance. There is design in living things, their shapes, forms, the ability to live, all have meaning. Our values are indwelling and dependent upon time and space unmeasured. This, in itself, is beauty. My point is the following. As the son of a native artist and a modest collector of contemporary Indian art in the days before becoming a museum director, I always have loved and appreciated our cultural material for its sheer aesthetic qualities. I have watched with pleasure as this work has come increasingly to be valued on the same basis by others outside the Indian community. In representing, interpreting, and most important, understanding the material and its meanings, however, it is not sufficient in the end to get bound up in debates over whether it satisfies Western standards and definitions of art, because we miss the point in doing so. Art lovers can stand in awe of a Popovide ceramic pot for its beauty as art. But if they do not know the linkage between Popovide's worldview and community and his personal creative spirit, the interpretation of the pot and its potent and defining cultural lining is incomplete. And it can be made complete only by honoring the place of that nexus in defining the meaning of the object. Significantly, many contemporary native fine artists view the matter similarly. Rick Hill, an artist and former museum director, puts the matter this way. The main difference between Indian and non-Indian artists is that we are still community-driven. Art is the cement that binds the Indian people together, uniting us with our ancestors and with generations yet to be born. Through art, we can take a look at why language is important, why ritual is important, and land is important. With his characteristic frankness and edge, contemporary Apache sculpture, Bob Houses, the renowned son of the renowned sculptor Allan Hauser, and in my view, a brilliant artist in his own right, makes the same point regarding the essential nature of Indian objects. I want to see people participating in my work. That's totally contrary to what we're taught in America, the artist as an individual, the genius. I don't want to see that in my work at all. I'd rather see, at the most, a cultural reflection of being an Apache. I've been fighting those concepts of individualism, uniqueness, and universalism, concepts that are totally contrary to tribalism. Individualism designs a future or a past awareness. You claim it, you own it, but you're not a part of it. In other words, through the millennia, those native people we now call artists were not so much in the business of producing art objects. They instead were creating aesthetically remarkable material whose primal importance lay not in the object itself, but in the fact that it reflected, indeed embodied and personified, the processes, ceremonial and ritualistic, that define the very community culturally. As the director of not one, but 2 museums that hold internationally renowned native collections, I witnessed firsthand the complexity and the pitfalls of representing native art through this interpretive paradigm. I remember the screeching, for example, and that honestly is all I can call it, of a critic for the Wall Street Journal, all of about 35 years old, and hell-bent for cultural leather, upon her reviewing an inaugural exhibit of the National Museum of the American Indian at its George Gustav High Center in New York. She loudly complained in the following terms. A note explains, she wrote, the different voices that surround some of the objects speak for them, since they cannot speak for themselves. Nonsense. These objects speak very eloquently for themselves. Ironically, she continued, items in the museum shop are more respectfully displayed than the museum's own artifacts. Grouped by tribal affiliation and medium, they are in well-lit cases with cards listing only the artist's name and nation. The museum's curators would do well to study them. I want to be somewhat more gentle with this critic than she was with us, because her motivations in one sense are laudable and basically kind. Specifically, she was disconcerted and dismayed by parts of the presentation because they declined to represent and interpret the objects exclusively as art, which I would venture to guess was in her mind and in the Western art tradition the highest compliment that could possibly be paid to the material and the most significant meaning that it could have. In the end, unfortunately, her academic rigidity and unabated tone deafness to potential multiple meanings of art and objects denied her access to insights she otherwise might have had if she had listened and tried to absorb rather than only preached that which she knew. So, as is our wont as Native people, let me leave as I began, with a story. It is about a Northern California basket maker named Mrs. Matt, who was hired to teach basket making at a local university. After 3 weeks, her students complained that all they had done was sing songs. When, they asked, were they going to learn to make baskets? Mrs. Matt, somewhat taken aback, replied that they were learning to make baskets. She explained that the process starts with songs that are sung, so as not to insult the plants when the materials for the baskets are picked. So her students learned the songs and went to pick the grasses and plants to make their baskets. Upon their return to the classroom, however, the students again were dismayed when Mrs. Matt began to teach them yet more songs. This time, she wanted them to learn the songs that must be sung as you soften the materials in your mouth before you start weaving. Exasperated, the students protested having to learn more songs instead of learning to make baskets. Mrs. Matt, perhaps a bit exasperated herself at this point, thereupon patiently explained the obvious to them. You're missing the point, she told them. A basket is a song made visible. I do not know whether Mrs. Matt's students went on to become exemplary basket makers. What I do know is that her sublimely poetic remark, which suggests the interconnectedness of everything, the symbiosis of who we are and what we do, the nexus between the intangible and the tangible, the interdependence of the physical and the spiritual, embodies a whole philosophy of Native life, cosmology, and culture that speaks volumes about the powerful and abiding relationship against all odds and much of history between Native art and art objects, and our continuance as Native peoples as a vital and living peoples and cultures into the future that the ancestors wanted and died for, quite candidly, on our behalf. Let us never cease honoring their gift of beauty and cultural meaning. Thank you very much.